In the last video, we talked about the history of the payment processing industry, and now in the next 3 videos, we're going to dive into banks, card brands, and ISOs and processors to really understand the major players in the industry and really what they do and what they provide. So let's start in this video with banks. So there are 2 types of banking institutions in our industry: issuers and acquirers. Now, I am using the term bank loosely here. There are definitely some different entities that do issuing and acquiring, which we'll talk about in a second. But for the purposes of this module, we're just going to use the word bank because 95% of the time it's a bank that does these things. So issuing and acquiring. So we're going to hear in this industry terms like an issuing bank, an acquiring bank, or an issuer and an acquirer. What does that mean? An issuing bank is the bank that is issuing the card. Okay? So what that means is if you go in your wallet right now and you pull out your debit card or your credit card, doesn't matter, either one, that card was created by and sent to you by an issuing bank. Okay? What does the issuing bank do? The issuing bank, number one, issues the card. The issuing bank is the one that actually has the money, right? If I go into a store and I want to spend $100 and I whip out my card and I swipe it through the terminal, that $100 eventually has to come from somewhere, right? Somebody has to have $100 that's eventually going to go to the merchant. Who has the $100? The issuing bank, okay? Now, that issuing bank could have that $100 in one of 2 types of accounts. It could be in a credit account or it could be in a checking account. Now, we're all very familiar with the concept of the checking account, right? We all have a checking account. We have money in there. We go and use our debit card, whether it's signature debit or PIN debit. We're using that debit card, and as a result, our issuing bank, the bank that issued us our debit card, they are simply taking that money out of our bank account, and they are giving it over to the acquiring bank, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the money has to come from the issuing bank, all right? A couple of other things about the issuing bank that are very interesting. The issuing bank charges something called interchange fees. So let me explain how this really works. So let's imagine for a second, we'll use the example of a bicycle shop because it's an easy one to use. So let's say we have a bicycle shop and this bicycle shop sells bicycles for $100, okay? Let's say I'm a consumer and I want to go buy a bicycle for my son and I want to go buy a $100 bicycle from the bike shop. I go in, the owner says, sure, you can have this bike. I swipe my credit card that I got from my issuing bank that has an available balance, a credit balance of, let's say, $4,000, right? So I go in there, swipe my card. What actually happens here? Well, what happens is that Visa is going to reach out to the issuing bank through this electronic network, and they're going to say, hey, issuing bank, we know you're the issuing bank because of the card number. We can see that. Does this customer have $100 of available balance? The issuing bank is then going to reach back out and say, yes, here's an approval code. He does have $100, and we are going to hold on to that $100 for a day or so here until you reach out and say the transaction was finalized or completed. So that's why when you look in your bank account, you're going to see those pending transactions, right? We've all seen those. So what happens is they reach back out and say, hey, yes, the money is there. We're going to hang on to it. Here's your approval or authorization code, right? So then Visa is going to reach back out to that terminal at the merchant's location and say, this transaction is approved, okay? Well, now a really interesting thing happens, right? Now what happens is the money is still technically sitting in my bank account. There's a pending transaction, but I mean, the money hasn't left my account. It's certainly not in the merchant's account yet. And so now we have to get something called an acquiring bank. Now, the acquiring bank is the bank that collects the money from the issuing bank and then pays that money to the merchant. So this bicycle shop owner is doing credit card processing, and his processing company has an acquiring bank. Let's say, for sake of argument, it's Wells Fargo. So the acquiring bank is Wells Fargo. So now Visa is going to say, cool, we have this approval code. Everything's ready to go. Now, once that transaction at the end of the day is settled or batched, so at the end of the day, each terminal is going to settle or batch, which means it's going to look in the terminal and say, okay, we sold 10 bicycles today for $100. So we have 10 transactions in there for $100 each. Each of those transactions has an amount, has an authorization code, has a name of the cardholder, all the cardholder data. They're now going to send that up to the acquiring bank. And so now Wells Fargo gets that and says, oh, okay, so these 10 transactions are finalized. Then Wells Fargo, the acquiring bank, reaches out to the issuing bank right? Maybe it's Bank of America where you got your credit card and they say, hey, look, these transactions are done. You need to go ahead and pay us the money so we can pay the business owner, right? So the acquiring bank is the one that handles all of getting the money, dealing with the merchant to send that money to the merchant and move that money around. Now, here's an interesting thing that happens though. The issuing bank actually does not send the acquiring bank $100. So I bought the bike for $100. My transaction is pending in my account for $100. So the acquiring bank is looking for $100 to give to the merchant, but they don't get $100. In the US, they get about $98.30 on average. Why? Because there's something called interchange fees. 1.7% of every transaction, on average, it varies a lot, but on average, 1.7% of every transaction is an interchange fee that actually goes back to the issuing bank. So the issuing bank, why would they, if you think about it, why would the issuing bank issue all these cards? Why would they do all the stuff that they do and provide this credit, and be part of these networks? To make money, right? The way they make money is not just by charging interest on the cards. They also make money not just from the interest from the consumer side. They also make money by charging interchange fees. And the way it works is they basically just hang on to the interchange fees and they don't pay the full $100 to the acquiring bank. They actually pay $98.30 on average. So now the acquiring bank has to go back to the merchant and say, hey, look, we didn't get the full 100, we got $98.30, and we have to get paid for our trouble as well, and the processor has to get paid. So the business owner, on a standard processing program, the business owner may only get $97 out of that 100 because they had to put a certain amount of money into these various costs to cover for the issuing bank, the acquiring bank, and we'll get to the processor here in a minute, okay? So as far as the issuing bank and the acquiring bank, very simple. The issuing bank issues the card. The acquiring bank collects the money from the issuing bank and disperses it to the merchant or the business owner. The issuing bank charges interchange fees, or more accurately, they hang on to those interchange fees and they don't pay the full amount of the transaction to the acquiring bank. They're keeping part of it as interchange fees. And then, of course, the issuing bank also is the one that is, handling things like chargebacks and things like that will happen where they're initiating these things where fraud and all of that. And so we'll talk more about that in other modules, but the banks do a little bit more than that. But basically, they're moving the money around. Issuing banks are issuing the cards. Acquiring banks are getting the money and putting that money over in the merchant's bank account. In the next video, we're going to talk about card brands and a little more specific about what they do.